All right, great. We see a lot of people coming into the webinar already. Thanks for joining us today. We will get started in just a few minutes. A few housekeeping items before we dive in. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will send you a copy of the recording along with a copy of the presentation slides after the webinar concludes. Today we will be using the chat box to submit questions to our host and our featured guest today. So please do locate that chat box at the bottom of your screen and feel free to go ahead and send any questions that you might have and use that during the presentation. We will also be launching live interactive polls during this session. So please look out for those and participate when you're prompted. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dan at this point. So thank you everyone once again for attending, and we'll get started here.
Okay, well, thank you everyone. We'll give folks just one more minute to join before we get started. But we're already at the top of the hour, so I will actually go ahead and start. I want to thank everybody for joining. It has been, I almost want to say this presentation will be about a lot of headlines, and if you've been following in the papers, the headlines are all over the place. It's information overload, and so it's always helpful to hear how other people are interpreting these items. As I want to bring in Bret Prebula. Bret has about 14 years of experience and primarily in upper management and roles in municipal government. Bret started his career at the County of Napa, holding positions such as corrections administrator, principal management analyst in the county executor's office, and assistant treasurer tax collector. Bret moved to the City of Napa, where he was finance director before he started his current position as finance director in the City of Benicia. Bret holds a master's in business administration and has been involved in many municipal organizations, both regionally and nationally. As far as myself, the moderator, like many of you, I started my career in government audit. I worked in local government for 29 years. I'm now back in the private sector practice as a consultant to and for GovInvest. If you're not familiar with GovInvest, they're a technology firm providing financial modeling software and consulting services to local governments in their pension, OPEB, labor forecasting, and long-term forecasting now. They are rapidly growing and are now in 16 states. And we recognize the importance of complexity that governments are facing. And there's a lot of tools out there to help manage, whether it's your pension, whether it's your unfunded liabilities associated with pensions, negotiating labor, a lot of services that are at your disposal. So, this session today is about a lot of this, I like to call over the last year, this overabundance of uncertainty. And, the Fed, FOMC, Federal Markets Open Committee, released some information today, indicating that the economic activity, employment has continued to strengthen. The sectors that were most adversely impacted by the pandemic have improved in recent months, but they'll be affected again by the recent sharp rise in COVID cases. Job gains have been solid and unemployment has substantially declined. Supply and demand imbalances related to the pandemic and reopening of the economy have continued to contribute to elevated levels of inflation, but overall the financial conditions remain accommodative, and in part reflecting policy measures to support the economy and the flow of credit to U.S. households and businesses. But they do acknowledge that the path of the economy really continues to depend on the course of the virus, and progress on vaccinations and easing of supply constraints are expected to support gains in economic activity, and as well as the reduction in attempted reduction to tame inflation. So when we look at the pandemic, of course, this is dating back to the end of December, when Omicron took a very sharp uptick, and you see that exponential growth starting to occur. And you can see in the next slide. Look at the scale that Omicron had relative to both the beta and the delta waves. And you can see by January, it just dwarfed the previous waves. And even though that this wave is less deadly, for lack of a better word, the cases, just because the sheer volume of cases, the number of deaths associated with Omicron has just recently surpassed Delta, unfortunately. And we can all hope that this quick rise will lead to a quick ascent, but I don't think we can take that for granted. There was a recent article in the Atlantic that epidemiologists say, well, it'd be nice and neat if it came down as a quick ascent, but acknowledge that Omicron, we may not see the worst of it, and we could have this up and down effect, especially if we let up too early. There are other opinions that really acknowledge that, hey, it's probably game over for COVID-19, with the number of items that are tools to deal with Omicron, that we should start seeing the end of the pandemic. But I don't think anyone knows for sure. So what we've seen, combination of inflation, supply chain disruptions, that Omicron will continue to take a toll on global growth. And want to invite Bret at any time to make sure you want to jump in on any of
Yeah, no, this was where I think it's important, the data that you showed is important and valuable, but I think it does kind of go to this meeting point where, regardless of even if the descent of the current variant, drops rapidly, and maybe we end up with this being what is more of a seasonal flu over time because of the medical interventions that are now available, I think the impact of what it's done to our economy is still very much in the infancy of understanding. And so as we kind of look forward past that, I think as a society, we'll get benefits that we may be through it at some point, potentially quickly, potentially a little longer. But we can't lose sight of the fact that it has triggered things in our economy, whether that's supply chain, inflation, that I don't think anyone, because in our history, we really haven't experienced an environment with a pandemic and what, for lack of a better term, are managed interest rates, and the managed interest rate side alleviating itself as the pandemic's coming off. We could have some significant economic shocks to the system that have immediate impacts on municipal government, but also delayed impacts. And I think keeping those in front of mind, doing some kind of projections and analysis under a variety of those scenarios, typical to what stress tests see in a bank when they evaluate them post 2008 recession, I think is just an important overarching item for all of us in municipal government to be mindful of as we feel these humanistic successes of not being in a pandemic moving forward at some point. But really the economic impact could still be something that we have to tackle pretty significantly.
Thank you, Brett. So, you know, we do see, especially with the Beijing Olympics coming up and China taking a hard stance, a zero tolerance policy towards the pandemic, that some of their lockdowns are hitting factories and ports to, you know, continue some of those disruptions to the supply chain. So let's talk about stimulus. We have seen an unprecedented amount of stimulus authorized, and the distribution is still in process. But a lot of this is related to printing money, and that excessive printing of money can lead to hyperinflation. And so when we look at the scale of our reaction to this crisis, it pales in comparison to how countries reacted to the 2008 crisis, which is represented in black, and the COVID crisis. You can see the amount of stimulus that has been pumped into the economy globally really dwarfs the amount of stimulus that had been issued or authorized in the 2008 crisis. And it's through a number of different measures, whether it's monetary policy, they're buying back, adding to the Fed's balance sheet, or direct support to through the various acts. It has been unmatched in both the scale, the speed, and the type of stimulus.
And I think, Dan, the important thing that I've noticed, and it's kind of a theme of a lot of what I'll be talking about with you today, is the interconnectivity of the impact of that downstream on government, right? Which sometimes, it's maybe hard to make those nexus connections. But in this case, I think unlike other interventions that we took, whether it's 2008 or other recessions previous to that, not only by the order of magnitude is it much more significant, but I think the impact it's had on the consumer has been much different, right? So the stock market went gangbusters over this time frame in an environment that you otherwise probably wouldn't think that would happen, right? We had an online economy that did not exist in the form that it is today in previous recessions, right? So the demand of the consumer rose so much more significantly. And in my previous life with the city of Napa, we saw a huge downtick in TOT that was near our estimates, almost 20% of our total general fund revenue. But the sales tax side considerably outpaced the downturn we thought it was going to have, right? Which happened for many jurisdictions throughout the country. And I think what is interesting about that was helpful during the time, right? And really, I think, may have assisted in other reductions in revenue that were related to the pandemic, potentially pulled forward demand in a way that we may have not seen in previous recessions, right? And so I think being mindful, as those of us in a government setting where sales tax is one of the bigger drivers potentially of your revenue sources, how much of that demand was pulled forward, and being mindful, and frankly, a strategy I've used is listening to the transport industry earnings calls, FedEx, UPS, things like that, to get a sense from the private sector of how much they believe that demand was pulled forward, because it has a possibility, I know not always directly, but in a lot of cases, to trickle down into the local economy demand too. And so, using that kind of tactic to take this more macro private sector information that's available and apply it to what potentially could be going on in the future locally, I think is unique to this type of government intervention and holding, buoying up what could have been a pretty significant recession if not happening. And so being mindful that as you look at projecting and planning, whether you're city manager, CEO, or a finance officer, moving forward in government, I think is going to be important and somewhat unique to this era that we're in that may have not hit us in 08 or even the 99 recessions.
Yeah, and to that point, I think as finance directors, it's easy for us to really get wrapped into the issues that are right in front of us. But keeping an eye on some of these macroeconomic events and understanding and anticipating that trickle down effect is probably the theme of this presentation. So that's something we'll probably keep trying to reinforce as we go along. I have not been immersed in ARPA and CARES Act funding, so I'm going to turn this over to, thankfully, turn this back over to Bret.
Yes, I think we all are grateful that it happened, but also, as in any federal or significant state funding, hate every regulation and problem that comes with the getting that money. And especially any of you that have been in disasters with FEMA know that it can be difficult at times. So what we're going to focus on in the next few slides on ARPA and CARES Act is less about the actual regulations that I'm sure we have all on the Treasury webinars and everything about, revenue loss calculations and how best to report, and really focusing more on kind of the easier ways and efficient ways to look at strategy and compliance related to it moving forward. As I said, the Treasury outlines the approved uses and the reporting requirements, and that's going to be prescribed and continues to be kind of massaged over time with them. But your plan is controlled by you, right? You and your electeds, or the plan that you put forward to your electeds. And I think being able to have utilize and identify as much flexibility in that plan that you can provide as finance officers to your electeds, that really allows the funding to obviously be put forth for the public health need that's there, but utilize it in a way that can still meet the reporting requirements and improve uses, but have maybe an even greater community benefit than just that kind of immediate response reaction to some of the funding. I think is important. It's something that has to be planned out. It's something that has to be discussed very directly with your councils and governing bodies, so they're informed. So there isn't the shiny object tendency in these kind of critical incidents or events that occur that can kind of take the eye off the ball of the bigger picture of what the recovery for the community means, which is and does take into account some of that acute need to react. But also there's kind of a recovery phase out of it that I think in non-natural disasters like earthquakes or significant floods, that recovery is a little clearer. In events like this that are public health / economic crisis, I think that that's a little more cloudy and not as something we're consistently used to in jurisdictions that are used to dealing with natural disaster recovery. And so being mindful, thinking outside the box, still within the big box of what Treasury wants, but thinking outside that box is important. You have a quote there where it says, "You may not find a path, but you will find a way." I think, that just is kind of a simple way to put, you really find those kind of approved gray areas that allow your agency the most flexibility with your plan to have the most community benefit moving forward. Next slide. So I think that starts with educating your policymakers. So making sure whether you do it in 1x1s or 2x2s, however you need to not violate your respective laws around public meetings, is important. And having them, not to such detail that they're obviously not going to follow, because that's why they have all of us as professionals managing it, but at levels so when you go forward with these creative plans, that they understand the context for which you're bringing them to them, and that you're trying to deal with the acute issue, but really focus also on this larger recovery that's related with COVID, which really could splinter off into a variety of areas depending on your community, and to not lose sight of thinking in that way and being more broad and not as narrow focused as we might think with just specific, always public health responses, because after this, as we talked about, there's going to be a local economic and community impact from coming out of the pandemic that we need to be able to manage too. And this funding can be a big piece of helping that. I think key to strategy, and it falls a little bit on the compliance side, but it really is part of the strategy, is developing program management procedures. Because that really tells you what you can take on and the level you can take on. Depending on the sophistication, size, or current staff makeup, which many of us have been impacted by COVID, of your organization, really having those set in the front end, especially when it comes to federal funding, I think is important. And I know many of us probably do that as a course of business, but really being mindful in this case with the amount of money and the kind of high spotlight nature of this funding, probably politically for all of us, that you have procedures and a management program that's in place that tells you really, if we do this too big a project, we can't really manage it administratively in a way that's effective relative to approved uses / reporting. And so it at least shrinks the creative window potentially a little bit, or at least tells you the level of creativity you can use that you can still manage administratively moving forward before you already have those conversations. And then as you're looking at expenses, what we're trying to strategize here in the city is really using the largest tranches we can of expenses in order to limit the amount of staff time related to constant tracking of dollars here, dollars there, that ultimately add up to millions, right, that you have to do. But thinking big, not small, on what community benefit, what recovery benefit can this money have that has that broader, larger impact and isn't so small that we have to do 100 of them when we're already staff demanded. Is there a way to get that kind of larger ROI with a bigger program that is more community wide and isn't like onesie twosieing it to get to these approved expense levels? And I think lastly, on the strategy side, which seems to always be something that creeps in every jurisdiction that I've been, is that one-time cost for this money that we're using it for, because it is one-time funds, is truly one time. And I know I'm preaching to the choir in this group, but there are so many hidden costs, whether that's a maintenance agreement attached to the one-time cost that's 5 years, whether it's repairs and that happen every 2 years consistently with some piece or program that you buy. There are so many different hidden ongoing costs that then could have downstream impacts, like having to increase your reserve requirements if it's based off a percentage of expenses. Being very, very mindful with that in your city managers and CEOs and policymakers as they're looking to make these decisions with you is very important, because the last thing you want to do is spend $5 million of one-time money and add $300,000 to your ongoing budget when you really aren't prepared from that from a revenue strategy standpoint. And I think that's really a vital piece, especially when you're kind of asking staff for ideas or executive team for ideas, is that they're mindful and front of mind with those hidden kind of ongoing cost potentials as well. Next slide.
Okay, Brett, I'm going to take a quick break here. Somebody reminded me that I have not asked any polling questions yet. So I do want to ask folks what sort of agency that you work for, so we have a little bit of feedback of our audience. And I want to thank you for reminding me to get those polls going. I also noticed someone raised their hand and would ask you to use the chat box. So there may be a question associated with this slide. I will end the poll here. Give you a last second. Looks like what we see is 0 from the state, 73% city, county 5%, water districts 2%, special district 18%, and private sector 2%. So I don't see any chats or further questions in the chat, so I'll move on to the next slide. And Brett, take it away.
Yep. So, I think it's important when we look at compliance, we realize that, whether it's ARPA or, the initial CARES Act funding, that it's not a lottery ticket. It just can't be spent on whatever. You want to make sure you're managing the compliance on top of those strategies, as I talked about before. But again, not allowing it to be such a restrictive path that you really don't get as big a bang for your buck as you can with the funding that has come from the federal government. I think, depending on your level of sophistication, I think it's important, as I talked about, with setting up that program management, but also being realistic on your ability relative to your comfort level with federal funding, reporting, and uses to crawl before you walk. So making that clear with your city manager and how you look at strategizing based on your industry, whether it's your agency as a whole or your finance department or even the city manager's office, of the sophistication of dealing with federal funding. If you don't have a ton of it, then maybe being a little less creative with that plan is a good thing, right? Because you don't open up yourselves to potential clawbacks in the future. But if you do have, experience with federal funding, whether it's the executives themselves or the agency as a whole, I think, again, thinking big, not small with those spending plans, to reiterate that, is important, right? And looking at those large kind of, as I talked about, doing in large tranches with big projects that really have big community-wide benefit, I think helps with compliance because it's easier to track and manage, but also could show the level of recovery that you're coming out with and how you're using that funding that, again, may not be just a COVID grant, but it may be something that is beneficial to the community related to COVID and approved, but has a broader community benefit as it looks to the recovery moving forward. And I think just being front of mind with that, again, to reiterate it, I think is an important piece on both the compliance and the strategy side as we relate to the federal funding that has come and cares and is coming and already come in ARPA. Next slide. So I think the last piece when it comes to whether it's these federal funds or frankly anything we deal with on a mass scale in our industry is use the resources around you. That can mean other experts in your agency, that could mean other experts within your region, that could be other experts nationally that you just know have a good grasp of this, which also includes consultants. We include one here. Many of you may be familiar with using HDL for a variety of services. They're what I'm familiar with in my career and have done a lot of good work. They specifically have a section related to ARPA that they are looking to provide that support. And whether it's HDL, whether it's GovInvest or another consultant that provides that good product and can be of assistance, I think building that in as appropriate as far as your spending resources is a vital piece to having success with dealing with these type of funding mechanisms and utilizing them and managing them in the best way. I think making that clear, that cost benefit to whether it's your CEO, city manager, and if needed, your governing bodies, is an important piece along the way, important step. To think that everything, especially in many of our agencies that are staff restricted right now, they can just be done by staff. I think asking staff to do more with less, many of us have crossed that threshold a long while ago. And so being mindful with the value consultants provide, finding the good ones, one of which we're on the call today, another in my experience has been HDL, and there are others, I think is just something to be, again, front of mind. And it's not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, in my opinion. And I think many city managers and CEOs would feel the same because they're going to be able to utilize the brain power of their internal organization with the efficiency of an outside consultant. So don't lose sight of that at this along the way. I think that's maybe an underutilized resource in our industry because we focus so much on costs, but there are times when spending money to quote unquote make money is a really important and I think valuable thing to do.
So let's talk a little bit about inflation. Let's talk a lot about inflation, rather. We're seeing a lot of headlines. U.S. inflation highest in 40 years. UK is saying the same thing, 30-year high. Canada, the same thing. I think that this is going to be universal. The LAO has, some prediction, while maybe outdated, that it's going to end sometime in late 22, but they acknowledge, and I do, note that they are not just taking a point forecast, but giving a range of events. And I'm a big fan of that, not just for inflation, but just in regular or any forecasting. Take a look at the the parameters or the distribution that your forecasts make. But you have a little bit of a guess or some help from the LAO's office, who I'm sure has looked at this in quite a bit of depth. So in the housing market, it's a good thing for property taxes. We've had U.S. Home sales reach a 15-year high. But they do note that the housing economists expect some of the frenzy to subside as mortgage rates start to continue to slide or back up, rather. And I think the nice thing about property tax is you get to watch the train wreck happen and have some time to react, a fair amount of time before it actually hits your. So things are good now. Just continue to watch what happens with the housing market over the coming years, knowing that you have some time to react before it impacts your tax rolls and your revenue stream.
I think, Dan, one other point to that's that downstream trickle down we talked about, is that much of the demand, one could argue, depending on the economist you talk to, can be attributed a little bit to government stimulus, right, on the demand side, but it also could be attributed to significant refinancing that's occurred on the housing side, right, because of the historically low interest rates. So as those rates rise, and I totally agree with you, the nice part about how property tax works in many governments is that you kind of have enough time to plan, which as long as we have time to plan, we can mitigate much of it. But if many people took refinancing to do house remodels or different things that had a sales tax benefit in your local community, right? Because they took that long-term debt and did significant projects, which kind of, again, pulled forward that demand. That's going away when interest rates start to rise up, right? We probably have seen the heightened level of refinancing that's occurred. And so that is not easy to ferret out on how much of your increases. I mean, you can start probably looking through the industries, is it more any industry that's one-time specific, lumber yards, builders, those type of things that they may see significant downtrends in sales tax for our respective regional and local economies. And so being mindful of that and at least, going through exercises to see, is that sustainable and that sales tax make up for you, or is it not, I think is very important, because it is related, I think, on some level to the ability for people to take out equity at an interest rate that allows them to have a same or lower payment, either to have better cash flow day to day, but also now have an influx of capital to do those one-time projects, but spur significant, in many cases, sales tax growth for our local economies.
So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide, but we know that millennials were really crushed by the 2008 crisis, and really didn't have the money for down payment in their 20s. So they are kind of coming back, and they're adding to the supercharging of the housing market, and they count for over half of the home park purchases and loans, increasing demand at this time, just adding to the housing crisis right now. Bret, did you have any quick comments?
No, I think that's important. I also think this generation, generically speaking, looks at spending in a very different way, right? They tend to just generically, again, be less savers, more experiential and spending money right out in that economy, which again may mean be focused on how much of that, depending on your community makeup, how much of that demand may have been pulled forward again. And I'm just mindful of that, because we can get kind of settled in to some of these temporary pops that don't look like one-offs in how they go over quarter, but really they are just somewhat longer, term, meaning, not 2 months, but maybe, 12 to 18 months relative changes that we don't want to get used to and settled into, if that's really not kind of that normal, you'll hear a lot reversion to the mean of what we're kind of going to consistently see in some of our revenue sources. So just, again, being mindful of that, I think is important from a planning perspective.
Here's another strange phenomenon is the chip shortage related to automakers, and they are being extremely judicious about how they allocate those chips. Just anecdotally, when my wife bought a new car recently, they gave her one key because they were hoarding chips. And they said, well, we'll give you your second key to your car when we get another chip. You could see in the headline here, that the chips are going to the most profitable cars. So therefore, you see, depending on the mix of your community, if it's sales tax on vehicles is based on domestic cars, the chips are getting allocated to those cars that have the most profit for the auto dealers. So we see the more luxury vehicles outpacing the domestic car purchases, which in turn is probably also partly impacting the cost of the used car market, which we know is also incredibly expensive. Brett, did you have anything?
No, I think, talking with your fleet managers, understanding, is this transitory in their mind, and digging into this is important, or is it something that's now kind of re-leveled the plateau of the car market or the automobile market in general? And the reason that's important is, many of our fleet allocations and how we charge out to be able to have enough money is built on some level of inflation factor. And if we're kind of breaching that pretty significantly, I think it's important to really be mindful of that. And if we think it's not something that can be mitigated by a little bit of use of reserves in the short run, really focusing on changing those allocations. I had an experience with a fire truck where we had been historically for years pretty spot on what the total would be when we went to have to purchase them within our fleet policy. And we were off by a factor of 200,000 because of the steel, semiconductor, and a variety of other things that had just made the prices of that type of vehicle significantly grow in the last 18 months. And so being mindful and aware of that, so you don't kind of have those shocks, or planning, if not all the way for what that might look like, some hedging of it to make sure that you're not having a big amount of money that you're gonna have to search for because you get sticker shocked based on rather larger fleet purchases that may happen in your respective agencies.
Okay, so we also see an impact, inflation impact on tourism. Hotel prices are going up, while airlines, they're ticking up, but they're still historically low. We see more fast food driven versus the sit-down restaurants, although you can see both are steep climb, and I'm sure the sit-down restaurants are, again, dependent on the trajectory of the pandemic. There's, of course, an impact will be impacted by the inflation surge, the ability to to combat the supply chain disruptions. We can see manufacturing has dropped, and that could be labor force issues associated with Omicron, but policies even in China to really crack down on the variant, again, reducing manufacturing and in turn supply to the U.S. And of course, oil prices have you've seen that on the rise, and some of that is a lot of that is really, can't forget about geopolitical tensions, where oil may be used as a strategy and to mitigate shocks on the market. If Russia decides, well, in turn, if we reimpose sanctions on Russia, if they invade Ukraine, we may withhold energy supplies in retaliation. So that's part of the drive. But that's a consumable for most agencies. So your gas prices are likely to increase.
And I think even taking it beyond gas, many petroleum, comes out of in a lot of products we use. And so making sure that inflation tick up there related to the higher oil prices isn't happening too, and being mindful that even beyond fuel is something to just, again, have that awareness as you're looking to current and future budget planning.
So, I thought this was telling, the economy is suddenly running low on everything. The surge on demand is upending supply chains and leading the charge probably to potential hyperinflation. Bret, do you want to comment on this? I know we need.
Yeah, we've seen this in the IT world for us. Whether we continuing to enhance our remote work environments, getting new employees on board. We've had a significant difficulty kind of getting our normal suite of laptops and monitors and scanners and whatnot, which, doesn't maybe on the surface seem like a big issue, but when you're trying to onboard staff and you don't have this equipment going remote work, and being efficient with it to make sure you have the right setups, we have seen months and months and months of delay, and we've seen significant price increases as well at times. And so, again, as we look at those of you that have IT allocations, being mindful of that, whether, look into whether you believe that's transitory or not, or again, is the industry resetting itself? Because as, looking at private sector businesses, these are actually opportunistic times for them, because much like many of us in California can remember when oil crossed the $3 or oil gas crossed the $3 threshold, it was like, oh my goodness, way back when. Now we would all be hoping and praying for $3 gas, right? We've reset kind of what we're comfortable level on that floor. My fear and a lot of the analyst stuff that I'm reading is saying that in many industries, they're going to use this to kind of recreate that floor. And so that means we are not probably going back to prices that were pre-pandemic in many industries. Some we will, but in many we won't. And so understanding that new normal of that price floor, again, whether it's fleet, IT equipment, things that we purchase rather significantly as municipal agencies and have kind of a cost plan development to achieve the ability to buy them year after year after year. Being mindful and updating those with your teams, I think, is important. You may feel like you have no changes to make, but at least taking the past to evaluate them under a few different scenarios, I think, is an important added step to all of our kind of budget planning moving forward.
I think we can all look back and say, if I would have, should have bought that thing last year. We can see almost in every sector, there's elements of inflation materializing. We see it in gas, furniture, outdoor equipment, furniture and supplies. We see in the grocery market, the cost of groceries and meat is expensive. And our folks at HDL are seeing some of the same things where the prices are growing faster than sales. And I thought this chart was a good indicator. Here they identify some of the industries where they're seeing some good, still strong growth. Some of that's price driven. And it's good to see hotels ticked up, but I'm sure this is a delayed impact, not accounting for the Omicron impact. Those will be affected as well. You can see their longer range forecast. We've had some surges, and looking forward to a good 21-22, tapering back to that reversion to kind of more mean averages. And before I get into workforce issues, did you have any last thoughts about inflation, Brett? We're about at 1244 currently.
No, I think we've really covered them, and just being mindful. And as I think you said earlier, focus on the macro and the micro, right? Don't lose sight of the macro impact, because that trickle down may be delayed, but will hit many of our agencies in the coming months and years, frankly, to come.
But workforce, we know everybody's struggling with workforce issues, and there was a great article posted in the Rockefeller Institute, and I want to give a nod to the finance director at City of Seattle. Glenn Lee was quoted in this article as well. But you know, how are we dealing with governments with this kind of mass resignation? And you know, you can see from the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics that individuals quitting from local government jobs are making a big component of the overall decline in the workforce. So how we think about this and how we deal with this in the future is very important. I think Brett will probably have a lot to say about this, about how we need to really, either adopt technology to change our service delivery model, because we need to really start looking to some of those non-traditional benefits.
Yeah, government. Yeah, no, I'm a strong believer in the government's workforce and the service delivery. They have to match up, number one. So to focus on going remote work in many instances, whether that's hybrid models, full for some positions, I think is obviously the first step. But you have to marry that, in my opinion, with the service delivery to the community. And in many instances, government stays with this physical driven service delivery, when in many cases we can do things more effectively, efficiently, provide better community service in remote aspects beyond just bill pay. You look at a lot of the services that our libraries can deliver. There are a variety of underutilized apps and things that they can be champions of to help the community with, whether it's Kindle level reading instead of coming in for books, or whether it's using that instead of an iTunes account, or other programs and education services. We look at how people view their accounts, how plan check works, right? Are we using services that allow plan check and plan review to happen remotely and digitally? Can it be more effective than doing it the old way of pen and paper? A lot of this seems obvious, but we typically in government, in my experience, aren't marrying up the change in workforce and how we work internally with the community delivery outwardly. And so the problem is, when you don't do it, in my opinion, you have the community that still expects much of it to be physically driven. And the flip side is, we're remote, and now you're incongruent on how you can deliver that better community service. So matching those up, I think, is imperative when you plan out. I do think, and I will joke with this, as we look at and hear about the metaverse, and I won't go too big on it, but I think government will tend to really not want to focus on that, cryptocurrency things, right? Because we don't want to be at the tip of the sword for a variety of very important reasons, right? But I think not completely dismissing those as we move forward in ways we deliver service, one, and how we receive currency, two, I think not a front of mind for today, but something to definitely not lose sight of as the months and years go forward, as I believe, and many others do, that those will become some mainstream level of the next generation of our communities. And so you see the mayor in Miami, there's a few that are being rather progressive in how they're looking at both avenues, the metaverse and cryptocurrency. But that goes back to aligning service, right? So as our communities evolve and change into even maybe those worlds over time, being with them as they change, kind of that riding that wave with them, to me, is an appropriate way to be. But you got to marry the way your workforce is going, and then that looks like remote for many of us, or I believe it should be, to kind of enhance the next generation. Got to match that service delivery as best we can with how we're working internally in those changes.
While I'm thinking about that, I will launch the second poll, which is, how many of you will be starting labor negotiations really in the next 6 months or year? And
while you're doing that poll, I'll add, as you go into labor negotiations, using the ability to have a very robust remote work program as a way potentially to limit your exposure in some instances in compensation increases, right? Because you effectively, in some instances, if you have a high commute employee base, you might be limiting their cost, right? Because they're not driving as much, less gas dollars, less ability for wear and tear on their cars, time away from their family. That has a dollar value to many employees, and maybe it can help mitigate some of the inflation cost increases that you might have to try and strategize around. Using other I'll say financial means to have those negotiations by your culture and environment, and really making robust changes in those directions. If that's what your community and workforce you think could desire, I think is a good strategy too on the union side as we all walk into those constant contract discussions.
Okay, so we saw about 50% of you are going to be moving into some form of labor negotiations, and as I move on to the next slide, I really can't stress enough the importance of succession planning and retaining mid-level experienced employees, especially if you have tier 2 employees. Having a plan to not, to retain that level, mid-level management. This same article by the Rockefeller Institute noted that, younger employees are bouncing around, so those that you've trained may not be available. The cut in pension benefits has eroded some of the interest in working for local government. So how will you continue to attract and retain those employees? I tend to think about, even parity for your pepper employees, which I'll touch on later. How will you keep them? There's a quote from GFOA. It's not necessarily that local governments are struggling to replace them, but it's the depth of the bench. So maintaining, what are your ways? And this is something I struggled with at Newport Beach was, maintaining mid-level management. I thought I did a very good job of starting that farm club of folks that, when I left, that would could step in my shoes through weird circumstances. After I left, I'd say, gosh, everybody that I spent almost a decade training and working to replace me, entire budget division left, the accounting manager left, the deputy director, and no fault of the successor finance director, but it was more an organizational view of how valued employees are, and underestimated those mid-level managers and folks, what I used to call the up and coming or next generation folks. There was misstep, and a lot of them left, and now it's probably very difficult to replace those folks. Mm-hmm. But Brett, did you have any quick comments?
I'll just echo what you said. 100%. In my experience in cities and counties, both moving over the last decade or so.
All right. So with respect to the pension cuts and the benefits, what I've seen looking at a lot of different plans is, on average, the most recent experience in California was that the pension costs or the funded status increased 7 to 10%. That's even with lowering the discount rate, but the future capital market assumptions appear challenging or dismal. So keep an eye on those future capital market assumptions. Here's just an example. We can see this plan was previously 75% funded, increased roughly 8%. When we look at the cost, if you just isolate the repayment of the UAL, you can see how sensitive they were to those excess earnings, and you can drop their costs, and that will improve over time as we switch out to PEPRA employees. This particular agency, while it was going to improve their UAL, also wanted to knock down their next year's hump. And you look at strategies to what this previous peak was when we were looking at things after the recession, that things were going to come to a head in 24, 25. Not only did the investment returns help, but active strategies to potentially knock down some of those humps or peaks are equally important. And that's what this particular agency did. And so those strategies are out there, and should take a look at them. We know that the normal cost will increase, and as a result of lowering the discount rate. But I think more importantly, when you look at it as a percentage of payroll, expect that your normal costs will drift down towards your PEPRA rates. So that's kind of the flip side with PEPRA is, while the 6.8% is more manageable rate to achieve, it will increase, but over time, but we're talking still decades, the cost will start coming down, and you can see it in normal cost as a percentage of payroll. In this case, the agency was looking at almost a 0.9% increase as a result of the lowering of the discount rate. But again, that's normal cost in a vacuum, but the overall trend moving down. But that's why you really should pay attention to your classic and PEPRA turnover, but also how will you achieve a parity for these folks. I think a lot of the PEPRA folks are really being having to either contribute at the same level that classic employees are, so give some thought about how you might continue to engage those folks, and how you will retain them in the future. It's you have time now, but I don't see too many folks adding, making sure, that down the road, how will they retain these PEPRA employees given lower benefit tiers? So, I think, one of the ways you can address that are either, achieving some parity for PEPRA members through employee matching contributions. One is portable, two, those are typically not non-pensionable DB or defined benefit costs, or won't contribute to the problem, but it's a means to achieve some parity for your PEPRA employees. Do consider what tactics that you may employ, not just on your legacy pension benefits, but how will you provide benefits and negotiate benefits for your PEPRA employees, as well as retiree benefits moving down the road. Bret, did you have anything?
Yeah, no, I think just to that point, if you go in that direction, making sure you define your deferred comp plans are and the management of them is done in a very prescriptive way, right? Some of my experience has gone into agencies, and it's kind of been a secondary thought about the plan management itself, right? Who you're using as your record keeper, the amount of investment options. So if we're going to enhance the use of it, right, which I think is a great thing for employees to assist in balancing kind of the retirement equality, and or just any employee to help enhance that, making sure you look at your policies around that, you look at your defined comp board if one exists or needs to exist, and how you manage that plan in general as again something that's actively managed, not passively managed, because people are going to look to it as needing to get either variability of how they invest, or to have competent people making sure those funds are meeting the benchmark goals and are the correct ones to be within the portfolio of potential investments. I think it's just an important tangential but connected piece of if you move to kind of enhancing that benefit for your employees.
So let's quickly move to interest rates. We're running out of time, and the end of cheap money, as I think often people will say. Do keep in mind that inflation is going to any of your internal reserves, even though that the 10-year has ticked up to 1.78%, and back in December, the 10-year, the real rate of return was still negative 1%. As of yesterday's close at 178, the real rate of return on a 10-year note is negative 63 basis points. So you should really talk to your investment advisor. If there's an appropriate, if some of your reserves are really to indeed as a hedge against adverse experience in your OPEB or your PERS liability down the road, consider hedging against inflation and making best use out of your 115 plans as well. But keeping it in-house, you just recognize you're going to be losing some purchasing power there. So, I think with the rise of interest rates, expect stock market volatility. We saw it, just earlier this week. These are quotes from the same day. Stock markets declining as a market sell-off accelerated, and by the end of the day, somehow miraculously turned things around and ended in a gain. This is the first time the Dow has been down 1,000 points and then finished positive for the year. And January 24th, we saw continued volatility. Gosh, there's many reasons for that sort of volatility. Maybe it's less important for the inner workings, but interest rates will be we're on everyone's mind. But I think most CEOs in the private sector recognize that that was one of their number one concern was inflation. It's becoming comfortably high, and then it really could no longer be dismissed as transitory. As Bret mentioned, the private sector, once they have profitability or savings in one area, they're not so quick to turn things, return to the previous norm. So, and then on top of that, running out of spare capacity, we've got still a high demand and scarcity of supply in both workforce and supplies. So that's why you see some turbulence. Bret, before we move on to rating agency considerations, anything you want to add?
No, just real quick. One thing is the wealth effect, right? I think that's a real thing in the stock market. And so as we get volatility or significant downtrends, I think the NASDAQ's down 12% so far in 2022. That has, again, a psychological impact on people's consumer consumption. And so, again, looking at those macro views that we may not necessarily impact our local economy immediately, but seeing that volatility or even the downtrend we've had now, if that continues, that wealth effect can have a big impact, especially if your community is somewhat affluent at a level that may have more non-retirement stock investors than others. And I think that really can have a pretty immediate impact on either your economy or if those people come to your economy to shop. I just think being mindful of that is very important moving forward.
I just made a gaffe and said that the video link will be available in a year or two. I just want to correct that for the record, in a day or two. Sorry about that.
It's like a movie. We got to edit it, do a trailer, it's a lot going on.
Not like my texting abilities. Anyway, rating agency consideration. So this is an article by Suzanne Corson with S&P Global, and some of the things that they're watching. Of course, inflationary pressures. How of course, pandemic is driving it. Maintaining a long-term balance. Still a focus on your pension and OPEB liabilities. How agencies are deploying their aid, future event risks, the elections, of course, we haven't seen, both political and ideological divides of this magnitude, but they're still watching elections. All these things play a part in how they may trickle down to agencies. And, their perspective is that, having, of course, reserves will allow this, you to have a flexible budget and an exit plan. So, make sure your reserves are replenished. Active management is always an issue. Of course, maintaining adequate liquid reserves is a key to credit worthiness. Budget controls. And then managing and deploying various rounds of stimulus. Brett, do you want to add anything as we're quickly running out of time?
No, I think you covered it well on this. And again, if you're looking to issue debt, just be mindful that those rates are going up, and the S&P is going to be focusing on the things you mentioned as you get those credit ratings. So if you have it in the pipeline, I think sooner than later, getting with your counsels to issue that debt, if you were already ready to do it, is very important to saving on that debt service.
This is a GFOA slide, and they just recognize that not all uncertainty can be estimated and or foreseen. So and it's usually underestimated. So I highlighted augment what you think what you may need for emergency, for uncertainty. You may add some cushion there. And we know that there are more pandemic waves. You've got a lot of geopolitical risk, a lot of local political risk, low income yields getting crushed by both inflation and rising yields. We know that you're going to be booking some, as interest rates rise, you're going to be looking at booking some large fair value losses, which just means ultimately that you're booking that your yield is going to be booked and recorded in a lopsided fashion. You kind of almost be booking, carrying forward those future borrowing against your future returns and having to book them. Well, that's when prices are going down. This is sorry, the other way. Interest rates are rising, so you will have to incur losses sooner than later. So that will put a drag on your total return. And just be cognizant of what that may, some of these impacts that we'll have on the market, and that slow reversion back to the mean. Because same thing with the equities markets, you book that 21% return, and the CalPERS side of things. That's a little like borrowing against future returns because the economy isn't, GDP is not growing at 21% a year, so there will be a slow reversion to the mean. Hopefully, it's a slow reversion and not a big correction like we've almost seen in the last few days, where we were in correction territory with these 10% swings. And then, of course, there's those other unknowns and uncertainties. Who could have predicted the pandemic? I'm sure there will be the next new thing. So maintain that budget flexibility by maintaining your reserves and cash is king. Having those multiple contingency plans. Brett, do you want to add to this?
No, and I think doing tabletop exercises more frequently, again, those stress testing, maybe not as comprehensively as our 5-year forecast models to look out with our governing boards, but doing a little more informally as you kind of get wind of changes in aspects of that to make sure that your reserve levels and just your sensitivity to certain economic changes can be managed in a way that can be planned. It doesn't create a reactive nature, as we move forward the years coming out of the pandemic.
So I won't rehash the takeaways. I'll let you know, there will be included in the presentation that will be distributed. And I know we were kind of all over the place because all the stuff is really intertwined. So, I tried to recap this a bit. Brett, do you want to make a quick comment on that?
No, I think it's important. A couple of things on here is to really understand those downstream effects, right? Be mindful of areas and macroeconomic pieces of data that you may otherwise not review, because I think they do connect coming out of a interest rate and pandemic environment that we're in, the combination moving forward. And I think, the last key is don't be afraid to ask for help, either to all of us as colleagues or to consultants, right? Or a combination thereof. I think we are asked to do as all municipal employees a lot with less. And so really understanding the ROI of getting the power of things we've already done to not reinvent the wheel as a collective, or what consultants can bring to enhance that. I think being mindful of that and comfortable enough to know that, again, it's a show of strength to be able to plan in that manner, because ultimately we're all trying to give that best community service support that we can for all of our departments and what they do more outwardly day to day, and support that as the internal kind of service, finance, and city manager piece of it.
Recently I spoke to one of my former colleagues who, was going through an ERP implementation, and we don't have time to take on another project. But those are the times when you want to reach out and say, is there something that I can take off my plate? Help me come up with my revenue forecast. Help me give our council a pension update. What did CalPERS decide? So, to the extent that you feel overburdened, overtasked, that's exactly when you want to find those discrete things that you can task out, and use your consultant as an extension of your staff. So can't stress that enough. And finally, I've included some resource links to today's FOMC statement, and the link to the Rockefeller site. We can take any quick questions, Brett, unless you want to make any wrap-up remarks.
No, I just think, we're all here for each other. I think whether it's great consultants that we find and developing those relationships, or just colleagues in general, I think being able to reach out to all of us to again, not recreate the wheel and get advice and see what others have done that have been successful is an important step to this industry continuing to grow as a whole, and just look forward to working with everybody potentially on some of these big items in the future.
Yeah, we're all former government public servants. I don't want to speak too much for Brett, but feel free to reach out to either one of us to rely on some of our past experience. I genuinely mean that. So reach out to me. Brett, I'll leave that to you.
No, I'd love to hear from anybody. Always willing to help. So thank you everybody for today. I just enjoy these dialogues and being able to kind of put out information so we all can value from it and from each other.
I don't see any questions in the chat, so I will take that as potentially a wrap. I want to thank everybody for attending. If you come up with questions otherwise, feel free to either call me or email me. I think or reach out through GovInvest. I didn't want to put Brett's information out there, but I'm sure you can find them in the
on LinkedIn or city website. Yeah, feel free. Happy to take calls or emails.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll make that a wrap. Kristen, did you have any last minute announcements about when the slide presentation will be distributed, or the video? Okay, Kristen may not be out there. So both will be available. I think within a day or two, they should go, whoever registered should receive a link, both of the presentation as well as the video. So I will thank everybody for their attendance. Yes, someone asked whether this is CP eligible, and yes, it is, and right, you check that box. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks all.